The second energy system we're going to talk about is glycolysis. And if we know the root of our word, right, we said lysis is to break down, glyco is referring to sugars in the body. And it can either be glucose, which is your blood sugar, or glycogen, which is just the storage form. And we'll get there in a second. But remember, this system, glycolysis, is very similar to our newspaper in our analogy. And the newspaper, while it can't start activity, right, it's relatively easy to catch it on fire if you have a match, but it doesn't just spontaneously combust. So it gets going pretty quickly, but it's going to last much longer than a match, but not as long as our third system. And so glycolysis is sometimes called your intermediate system because it's not your fastest system, it's not your slowest, doesn't produce the most amount of energy, it doesn't produce the least, it's that middle ground, it's good for in-between jobs. So glycolysis, typically we'll say it provides fuel for from about 30 seconds to 3 minutes of physical activity. So if you have an event or a task that lasts between 30 seconds and 3 minutes, predominantly the energy system being used is going to be this glycolysis. Now, if you fatigue the system, so you go all out for that 3 minutes, let's say that's your end result, it's going to take you somewhere between 30 to 90 seconds for that system to fully clear, fully recover. For the most part, that's what it's going to take, depending on how fatigued it would get. Now, if we remember, all of our energy systems are in the process, or the end result or the end product is this ATP, right? Trying to produce that energy so that we can then cause those muscular contractions. And what glycolysis uses as its fuel source is it's going to use C6H12O6, which if you have learned this before, you know that that is glucose, right? That's the simple molecule that we're going to use. So it can either use glucose, which is C6H12O6, or it can use glycogen, which is just a bunch of these glucose molecules all packed together and stored in your body. So the way I explain it is, think about glycogen as if you have 100 t-shirts, 100 glucose molecules, there are 100 t-shirts, and you take one of those vacuum bags. So you put it in the vacuum bag and then you suck all the air out. You could fit way more t-shirts in your closet than you could if you just left them in their original form. That's what glycogen does in your body, is it's our way of storing and compacting those molecules together so that they can have essentially more of them in your body for fuel when you need it. And so glucose or glycogen is the product we are using to create it. Now, unlike our last energy system, glycolysis can actually produce more ATP per molecule than your phosphocreatine. So if you remember the phosphocreatine, it took one creatine phosphate molecule and produced one ATP. It was a 1-to-1 ratio. Glycolysis, what we're going to see is we take this one molecule, and as we're breaking it down into smaller and smaller parts, we're going to get more ATP from it. And it's going to start in glycolysis, but then the end product of this system is actually going to feed into our third system, our oxidative system. And so we can get, if we go from start to finish breaking down this molecule, you can get anywhere from 32 to 38 ATP from a single glucose molecule. And so that's why it's more efficient, and that's why we can produce more energy for a longer duration because of it. Now, rather than draw out the recipe for glycolysis, I'm going to post it in this video so you can see it. But essentially, you have 9 to 10 steps, depending on if you're starting with glycogen or glucose, to take this and break it down through glycolysis. So glycolysis is a simple process of starting. So you start with glucose, you end up with one of two things. You either end up with pyruvate or lactate. And lactate is something you may have heard of before, because if you've ever heard of lactic acid, you understand that that is an end product or an end result of glycolysis. And we'll explain what we mean there in a second. But essentially, through these 9 steps, you're producing ATP, and you get about 2 to 3 ATP depending on what you start with as your fuel source. So we're breaking this down, we then end up with ATP, 2 to 3 of them, and we end up with either that pyruvate or that lactate. Now, pyruvate, if you have it, it's going to go to your oxidative system or your next energy system. And when we talk about your next system, we're going to say that pyruvate is where we start off. So instead of having C6H12O6 or that glucose molecule, we're going to have pyruvate as our starting molecule. Now, if you have plenty of oxygen available, that's when the end product is pyruvate, and it goes to your oxidative system. However, if you don't have oxygen, or if you're using so much oxygen that you can't keep up with the amount you're using, your body can actually turn that pyruvate into lactate. And lactate is a very interesting molecule because it actually helps us reduce acidity in your body. Now, a common thing associated with glycolysis is that burning sensation you get when you start lifting weights. If you've ever done like a set of 15 to 20, right, and you've experienced that burning feeling in your muscle as you're using it, as you're getting contraction, it's associated with glycolysis. Now, a lot of students think of it, or they've heard from coaches before, that it's because of lactic acid. Lactic acid causes the burning, right? We think about acid, we think about that burning sensation. We think about a reduced pH. But in actuality, lactate does not cause acidosis, and it actually helps buffer your pH so it doesn't become too acidic. And so when you break down your glucose, you get what we call hydrogen ions. And these hydrogen ions, as they're floating around, they actually reduce the pH in that muscle, and they create what we call acidosis, or an acid state within the muscle. And you can actually feel that burning sensation. Well, what your body does is, instead of letting all these hydrogen ions just float around creating this acidity, it actually connects it to lactate. So you have a lactate, you have a hydrogen ion, it binds them together, it produces what we call lactic acid. And then your body sends that lactic acid to your liver through a process we call the Cori cycle. And the Cori cycle takes that lactic acid and actually produces ATP with it. Now, what happens when you're getting that burning sensation, and that happens constantly throughout your body. So right now, I have lactic acid, it's going to my liver is cleaning it up. When you start doing high intensity activity, your Cori cycle cannot keep up with the production of lactic acid, and so those hydrogen ions are starting to build up, and that causes that decrease in that pH, which causes the increase in acidity, or the acidosis. And so the fatigue you're experiencing is not because of lactate or that lactic acid, but rather because of your hydrogen ions. So hydrogen ions are what cause the burning sensation. They are what cause it. Now, where does glycolysis take place? If we think about glucose, your cell has a certain amount within it, but it doesn't have an endless store, so it has a small amount. However, in your body, or in your bloodstream, you have a certain amount of glucose, and we call that your blood sugar. And so when a muscle needs energy when your body needs fuel for glycolysis, if there is glucose in your blood, that muscle cell will actually pull it into the fluid, and then it starts breaking this down. And so glycolysis is taking place in the sarcoplasm, and it starts to break it down. Now, your end product is either, like I said, pyruvate or that lactic acid. Pyruvate will then get shuttled into the mitochondria for your third energy system. Lactic acid gets shuttled to your liver to break it down to produce that ATP to clear the acidity. So the end result can either end up in the mitochondria or sent out of the cell to your liver so that you can clear it. So it goes into your bloodstream.